also a PhD in digital geography at LSE.
Okay, yeah, great.
Come along and have a listen.
Yeah, hopefully you enjoy it.
It's always good to just take our minds away from things for a while.
I know, especially during the PhD process.
Not too bad.
Yeah.
At the moment, I think.
How far in it are you?
I'm in fourth year.
Okay.
So
Wow.
I should be more stressed, but Carl's sitting next to me and he's really stressed. So it sort of evens me out.
It's all relative.
Yeah, exactly. Just stressing and shouting at the computer. Like,
All right, yeah. Okay, let's get started. So welcome everybody. I'm the lecturer for the rest of the module. My name is Nick Cernick. I have office hours today if you have any questions about anything or want to talk with me about it. I should apologize in advance today. I have quite a cold at the moment, so I'm sort of struggling through it. If I start hacking up a lung, I apologize for that. But I will try and get the lecture across today. If at any point I'm unclear, if I'm not loud enough or anything, just let me know, and I'm happy to pause and go through things again. Okay, another side note. I noticed today that the readings haven't been uploaded to Keats for this week or the following weeks. So I'm going to do that probably not today, but tomorrow I'll get around to it. You'll have access to all the PDFs and everything, so you'll be able to do the readings. But I didn't realize that, unfortunately, until today. That being said, the lecture slides are up now, so if you want to download and get a copy of these lecture slides, they are available up on Keats right now. Okay, this is an MA class, so I expect, I'm happy to have interruptions. If anything is unclear at any point in time, if you want to discuss a particular point in a bit more depth, it's always nice to get a bit of feedback rather than just me standing up here lecturing at you. So do feel free to raise your hand at any point or blurt out if you have a question or anything like that as well. Okay, with that, let's get to talking about the attention economy today. So we're going to begin with a very closely related idea called cognitive capitalism. This is an idea that, broadly speaking, capitalism has moved from industrial capitalism to what's now called cognitive capitalism. So the argument that we're going to see made by Jan Moulier-Boutang is essentially that if at one point in time capitalism was premised upon physical labor, upon people building things, doing things, producing things. Today it's more about producing ideas. It's about producing data. It's about these sort of immaterial aspects. So that's what cognitive capitalism is going to be all about. So it's an idea coined by a French economist, like I said, Jan Moulier-Boutang. He's done work on cognitive capitalism, immaterial labor, and things like a universal basic income as well. So what does he think cognitive capitalism consists of? Well, the first and most obvious one is the importance of the immaterial. So the economy becomes focused more and more on the production of immaterial elements. So you think about it, for instance, today, what's really important for a lot of businesses is producing things like a brand. It's things like producing copyright. It's things like producing ideas and services. Things which aren't necessarily a physical good that's being spit out by a factory, but instead something which is immaterial. It doesn't seem to have a sort of physical, corporeal existence. If you get into accountancy at all, which is surprisingly interesting once you do get into it, they talk about intangibles a lot. And one of the problems for accountants today is how do you measure the value of these sort of immaterial goods? It's one thing to go to a factory and measure how many cars are being output. It's a very different thing to go to an office space in Soho and try and find out how many ideas are being output. So how do you measure these sorts of things? It turns out is really difficult. Now, a specific element of all of this is the rise of data is associated with cognitive capitalism. This is increasingly obvious to us today. I mean, you're taking this degree for a reason. It's because the digital is now everywhere. So data, its collection, storage, and analysis have now become central to the economy. If we look at the wealthiest companies, the most important and influential companies, they're wealthy, important, and influential precisely because they have a lot of data. So companies like Facebook, companies like Google, companies like Alibaba, Tencent, all of these. Another important part of cognitive capitalism is the centrality of innovation. So what's important is not just the collection of data and knowledge. It's nice to have a lot of data, but what's really important is what do you do with it? So the use of it to generate new ideas. And this is where Apple got a lot of its power. It's the fact that it took ideas that were actually quite old, but it managed to innovate them in ways which became incredibly popular and profitable. Interestingly enough, Apple's really struggled with this since Steve Jobs passed away. They haven't really been able to capture that sort of innovation since then. Another aspect is the difficulty of technological progress. Now, this is sort of an unintuitive one. We would think that creating things is actually easier nowadays, but oftentimes creating something truly novel is much more difficult nowadays. You can think about this with a sort of historical example where back in the 1800s, back in the early 1900s, you would have individual inventors. You would have people who would create the light bulb on their individual time. Nowadays, to create something new requires a massive research team. It requires a huge research budget. It's incredibly difficult to produce new ideas and innovations nowadays. The other aspect as well is that this is all tied up with not just having the knowledge in place, but also the sort of complex social system that's involved with it as well. So having people who are trained the right way, having people who collaborate the right way, all these sorts of things go together to produce technological progress today. Changing division of labor. Nowadays, jobs tend to be much more flexible. So we won't talk about it a lot in this module, but there's an idea of being agile and being lean in businesses. You may have come across these terms before. And the idea is that the business becomes very flexible. So if a new problem emerges or a new trend emerges, your business is designed to be incredibly flexible and mobile. So you can change the division of labor very, very rapidly. So that's another thing companies do nowadays. But how do companies sort of manage the complexity of the new world? So we've got a huge amount of information, a huge amount of changing environments and circumstances going on right now. It used to be that companies would simply buy up other companies in order to manage the complexity. So a classic example here is something like General Motors, which would simply buy up the various aspects of the automobile production process. Today, companies tend not to do that sort of thing. Instead, they try and be companies that can learn, that can be agile, that can respond quickly. Another aspect of cognitive capitalism, the changing production sequence. So it used to be this idea of you come up with a brilliant idea for a product, you then move it to production, you spit it out of the factory, and then you try and get marketing to sell that good to consumers. Nowadays, these things are all blurred. So if you are somebody who's making money from YouTube, things like conception, production, and marketing, they're all sort of tied together. There's not that linear stage of one following after another. So these things become much more complicated nowadays. Likewise, blurring of inputs. So this sort of goes back to the rise of the immaterial. Nowadays, the immaterial is just everywhere. So it becomes increasingly difficult to separate the material from the immaterial. If you go to a factory assembly line nowadays, it's not just physical labor anymore. It's increasingly massively automated. There's a lot of intellectual production that's gone into things like assembly lines nowadays. And as this picture shows, people are also wearing things like Google Glass while doing factory jobs. So there's a blurring of inputs, according to Jan Moulier-Boutin. The emergence of networks as a new sort of business model. Networks are not clearly hierarchies, and they're not anarchic like the market either. There's an organization to the network that isn't either of those sorts of things, and it provides a sort of new model for cooperation and organization. Shift to cognitive work. This goes along with the rise of the immaterial. So most of us, how many people actually have ever had a factory job? I'd be curious. One person. Nobody else has had a factory job before? I had a factory job in my MA. I worked for Kellogg's and did cereal stuff. But most of us aren't going to do that sort of physical labor anymore. Most of us, when we leave here and go and get a job, is going to be cognitive labor. It's going to be work with our mind rather than with our hands. And again, this is relatively new. Industrial capitalism was something radically different from that. This goes along with the difficulty of technological progress. So innovation, again, is not something which happens by individuals anymore. It's something which requires a huge amount of investment and socialization. One of the reasons why Silicon Valley is so impressive is because they've managed to build a little ecosystem of innovation there. And that's incredibly hard to build, and it's incredibly hard to copy as well. So lots of countries have tried to copy the Silicon Valley model, but they haven't been able to accomplish the same sort of thing, in part because you have to have that community of people that can invent things. Crisis of property rights. This is going to be something which becomes more important as the module goes on. Property rights are very, very easy when you've got a physical good. So if I own something and you want to own it, I have to physically give it to you, and I have to sell those property rights to you as well. Now, with a digital good, property rights become much more difficult. If I have an MP3, you can all have the same MP3, even if those property rights stick with me. If I have an idea, that idea can be copied and influenced and modified, even if the idea is supposed to belong to me. So with immaterial goods, you start to see a crisis of property rights. It becomes very difficult to lock down who owns something and who doesn't own something anymore. One thing companies try and do in cognitive capitalism as opposed to industrial capitalism is to capture positive externalities. Now, this is an economist term for something that we're all well aware of. The fact that we're all going to university creates a positive aspect for us individually, but it also creates a positive externality for society more broadly. So think about it. The rest of society benefits from us getting an education. That's what a positive externality is all about. Now, what companies try and do nowadays is they try and bring people together and they try and get those positive externalities generated and then try and capture the value from them as a result. And I think lastly, a centrality of bioproduction. So Jan Moulier-Boutang comes from a French tradition of, let's say, autonomous Marxism. And autonomous Marxism has this notion about the ways in which knowledge is produced and sort of the conditions for knowledge production are incredibly important. So what we see, Jan Moulier-Boutang's argument is that as we see the rise of cognitive capitalism, we see more and more emphasis on not just the act of producing knowledge, but the act of producing the production of knowledge. So the example I have here is the innumerable stories that you can go online and you can find about how to be more productive, how to be more efficient, how to get more work done. And this is something which is, again, rather unique for cognitive capitalism. Industrial capitalism wanted lots of work done, but it was sort of a 9-to-5 thing. With cognitive capitalism, we start to see this work dissipate throughout the rest of society. Okay. So Moulier-Boutang argues that there's 3 broad features of different types of capitalism. So there's a type of accumulation. What is being accumulated in that type of capitalism? Again, industrial capitalism or cognitive capitalism. There's the mode of production, so how is production actually organized? And then there's the type of exploitation. So again, coming from a Marxist background, there's always some form of exploitation in the system. Somebody is the ruling class, somebody is the working class. So who and what is being exploited in this stuff? So if industrial capitalism focused on accumulating capital and labor, cognitive capitalism is all about accumulating knowledge and the capacity for creativity. And I think that's quite interesting, the capacity for creativity. So it's not just that you want innovation, the end result, but you want the capacity to innovate more and more. The mode of production, Jan Moulier-Boutang will argue, industrial capitalism was all about the expenditure of energy and labor in a rigid and hierarchical division of labor. So again, the assembly line is a classic example here. You organize workers and they do the same job over and over and over again. With cognitive capitalism, it's very, very different. So today, if we think about work, oftentimes it's people working through computers in different locations, trying to create things rather than through some sort of assembly line process. And lastly, the type of exploitation. So for industrial capitalism, it was exploitation of the labor time of the proletariat. And basically what this meant was that workers were producing for longer than what they were getting paid for. Now, under cognitive capitalism, it's argued to be different. Exploitation happens by us creating positive externalities, but then companies being able to capture that sort of extra value for themselves, even though it's our value that we've produced. Okay. Now, one question I want to sort of pose, just sort of get you to think about it a bit. This idea of cognitive capitalism, to me, it seems like it makes sense of a lot of the Western world. It makes sense of the American economy. It makes sense of the British economy. It maybe makes sense of the French and the German economies as well. But there's a real issue about whether or not cognitive capitalism holds elsewhere in the world. So one question I think to raise to this sort of research is, does it make sense of a country like China? Does it make sense of a country like South Africa? or a lot of other developing economies in the world. And to me, at least, it's not immediately clear that it does. So manufacturing, for instance, industrial capitalism is still a huge part of a country like China. It's still a huge part of a country like India as well. So cognitive capitalism, to me, seems like it might be a theory for the advanced Western world rather than for the developing economies. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. Yep.
I mean, I understand your point, but at the same time, wouldn't, if suppose underdeveloped economies depend on developed economies, then the customers will rely on cognitive capitalism.
Yep.
In that sense.
So there's still a part of cognitive capitalism.
I mean, I don't want to say it trickles down because that's for other people.
Yeah.
In that sense, I think there is a strong relationship. But I think that what you're saying is true. Is that it's kind of like a good capitalism to have it in a very acute sense.
Yep. Yeah. No, I think that's entirely right. So let me give an example that goes against my argument that I just made. Even in poor rural parts of Africa, people will have mobile phones. And if you have a mobile phone, it's a necessary part of even doing agricultural work nowadays. You have to know, where can I sell these goods? What price is right? All of this stuff is part of what might be termed cognitive capitalism. So even, the most sort of least developed parts of the global economy seem to at least be touching upon cognitive capitalism in some sense. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that you can't be separate from it. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're reading this stuff. Now, one consequence of cognitive capitalism, and I think this is something which you're all probably quite familiar with, but I want to point out that it's something which is relatively novel in the past, say, 20 years, which is the blurring of work and non-work. So I know when I go home later tonight, I'm still going to get emails from you. I'm still going to be doing work. So even when I'm at home and not in the workplace, I'm still doing work. And part of the argument that the cognitive capitalist people are making as well is that if ideas and knowledge and innovation and all of this stuff is really important for the economy, that doesn't happen in just a designated spot. So I know oftentimes my best ideas come just as I'm falling asleep at night. And I'll go and I'll write something down. And there's a sense in which you're always constantly grappling with ideas and producing new thoughts. There's a real sense in which work and non-work are increasingly blurring together. Now that's very different. When I did work at the factory, it was shift work. It was, what was the morning shift? The morning shift was 7 till 3. So 7 till 3 you would work, and then I would be done work. I would go home, and I would not have to give any thought to producing cereal anymore for Kellogg's. Now that's the way the work used to be, but a lot of the work that we do nowadays isn't like that. So this is, I think, again, something really novel to cognitive capitalism, and not necessarily a very good thing if you want free time. Now, another consequence of cognitive capitalism is ostensibly the end of scarcity. So with informational goods, if more and more of our economy, if more and more of our value is dependent upon informational goods, ideas, knowledge, memes, all these sorts of things, there's no reason that they have to be scarce. We could all have a collection of MP3s of every single song ever produced. We could all have access to every single book that's ever been produced. We could all have digital copies of those things. So there's no reason that we have to have scarcity of these things anymore. Now, this is a real problem for capitalism because capitalism wants to make money. And the only way that you can sell things is if things are scarce. Otherwise, people have free access to it all. So this is a problem for capitalism. It's one of the core problems of cognitive capitalism. But there is an argument that actually this could be a very liberating thing. And this is partly what somebody like Jean-Moulier Boutin will argue, is that we have a shift from industrial capitalism to cognitive capitalism, and we're now starting to see the potential for something beyond capitalism, where we don't have to worry about scarcity anymore. Now, that being said, there is one thing which is increasingly scarce nowadays, and that is attention. So this brings me to the attention economy. How many people have heard this term before, the attention economy? Okay, a handful of people. Okay, so the basic idea of it is to think of attention as a currency. So we only have a finite amount of attention to give at any point in time. If you're paying attention to this lecture, that means you're not paying attention to Twitter. If you're paying attention to Facebook, it means you're not paying attention to something else. So we only have a certain amount of attention to spend at any given point in time. The whole purpose of something like the advertising business is simply to get our attention, to get us to spend that currency on whatever object they're trying to sell us. Now I have an interesting example here. Oh no, it's not going to work. I may have to pull it up on YouTube here. Okay. Okay. To get you a sense of attention as a finite currency, here's a little video.
This is an awareness test.
Oh.
How many parts?
Okay.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
How many passes did they make? Any guesses? 12, 14, 13. Let's take an average of 13.
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So it's a nice little video from Transport for London asking you to look out for cyclists. But this is a really good example of attention as a finite thing. We can't pay attention to everything, and if we're focused on one thing,
Nikola Jokic had a
means we're
massive
not
game
focused on
against the
another thing.
Sixers. But post-game, he's just trying to get...
So this is what the attention economy is all about, is trying to get that finite attention pointed in a certain direction. Now, it hasn't always been the case that the attention economy has been around. If we go back to something like the Middle Ages, there wasn't that much to pay attention to. So literacy was rare. Only a handful of people knew how to read books, so you couldn't go around reading a whole lot. There wasn't a lot of entertainment, so there was, a weekly sermon that might be given. There wasn't a lot of paintings and artworks and advertisements and everything. You had a few religious images at best, and that was about it. And then maybe if you were lucky, you would have a sort of traveling theater show come through your village, maybe once a year or something like that. So attention in the Middle Ages wasn't really a problem per se. Now it starts to become a problem in the 1800s. And this is when newspapers first started selling advertisements. So when newspapers first began, there wasn't advertisements in them. There was just, information about the day's news. And then people had to pay a fairly large amount of money to be able to get access to that newspaper. Now, they eventually realized that you could subsidize the cost of the newspaper by selling advertising. So if you wanted the newspaper to reach a much larger audience, sell advertising space, and then you could sell the newspaper for a much cheaper price, or even for free. Now, once advertising comes along, that's when the attention economy starts to emerge as well. Because the advertising economy is all about how do you get people's attention. Now, in the 1800s, this led to the race to the bottom in media. So what I find really interesting about this is that a lot of the problems that we think are rather modern today, they existed just as well back in the 1800s. So sensationalistic media, making up stories, putting things like somebody that's been executed on the front page of the newspaper, all of that stuff was a way to get people's attention back in the day. So newspapers used to do that, and of course we still have publishers trying to do that nowadays as well. Even something like fake news, which would seem to be something that emerges only recently, actually emerges far earlier than that. So one newspaper back in 1835 was so desperate to get the attention of the readership, they created a whole 6-part series about somebody who had first used a telescope to look onto the moon and what had they found. So this was passed off as being a real legitimate thing that happened, that actually they found winged creatures on the moon. So here's an example of it. They wrote, "Certainly they were like human beings, for their wings had now disappeared, and their attitude in walking was both erect and dignified. They averaged 4 feet in height, were covered except on the face with short and glossy copper-colored hair, and had wings composed of a thin membrane without hair lying snugly upon their backs." And people believed this. Nobody else had a telescope to look at the moon and check it, but this was maybe the first example of fake news. It was a story completely made up in order to sell newspapers and grab people's attention. Now, another key moment in the attention economy is Herbert Simon's work in the 1960s. He wrote this quote in 1969, "In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." Now, for me, that's quite striking because that seems the perfect description of what we have today. A huge amount of information thrown at us, and we barely have enough attention to pay to any of it. And Herbert Simon is describing this back in 1969 quite aptly. The term information overload as well started to emerge in the 1960s. So, on a sort of chart, this is what we can imagine the attention economy to be like over time. So, attention is a finite resource. So it's the red line there. It doesn't change, doesn't go up or down. There's a finite amount of attention that we can pay. But what we have seen over the past 40 years with the rise of cognitive capitalism is a huge growing amount of information, a huge growing amount of demand for our time. So that means there's more and more competition for our attention. Maybe at one point in time we could have paid attention to everything, that time now seems long past. So I can remember even 20 years ago sitting in my parents' basement and trying to like download an image from the internet, and it would take 5 minutes to download a single image. Nowadays, I can go and I can get 4K live streaming of anything across the internet. The amount of information overload that we have is so incredible. The amount that has changed just in our lifetimes is massive. So, this poses a problem for businesses in cognitive capitalism because they want to get attention, but there's that increasing competition. So, the competitors, if you're a business, is any business that relies on a screen. So, crucially, really important businesses that are part of the attention economy, things like Facebook, Google, Twitter, Snapchat, all of these sorts of things which demand our attention, demand our engagement. All of them are effectively competitors trying to grab our attention. This is a quote from the Netflix CEO. He says, "At Netflix, we are competing for our customers' time, so our competitors include Snapchat, YouTube, Sleep, etc." Yep.
Is Samsung part of this economy as the probably world's biggest maker of screens?
That's a good question. What do people think? Is Samsung part of this attention economy? Or do you think that they're not?
It is and it isn't. It
Yep.
isn't in the sense that I think it's more to do with perhaps a more traditional industrial economy in the sense that they actually make screens and power other people's economies.
Yep.
At the same time, they are because they participate in specific. They have their software divisions not as strong as others, but
Yeah.
they do participate in.
Yep. Any other thoughts on Samsung? Is Samsung part of the attention economy? Yep.
I would be similar to what Stacey is saying. I would say Samsung more provides like the media for
Yeah.
this economy. Like obviously that's involved with what we're not creating, but
Yep.
I would consider that like a major player.
Yeah.
And you can see some of their intentions to sort of creep into the attention economy by, I think they might get that pretty big, trying to get a big suite of like smartphone
Yeah.
devices and things like that. So they're trying to get into that.
Yeah.
Community behind the industrial, not to be behind, but engaging in other.
I guess they do profit over it though because the changes in screens, the new screen is the Infinity O screen, which gives you more screen to be able to play with the economy in that way.
Yeah. And a foldable phone coming out as well now. Yeah. My sense for that sort of question would be that Samsung is they're still a very industrial capitalism company. They produce things. They build, manufacture things. But you're absolutely right that they're moving more and more into that attention economy stuff. So a really good example is something like Bixby, which is their sort of AI assistant thing. The thing with Bixby, the thing with any AI assistant, is that in order to make them better, you have to engage with them. So Bixby, to get better, demands your attention. And this is why, for instance, I know Samsung gets a lot of crap because they've got a designated button for Bixby on their phone, which nobody uses. It's just sort of a useless button. But that's precisely because they want you to use it so they can train their Bixby to get better. So they are increasingly part of the attention economy, I think. But it's a good question to sort of ask yourself, is this, what is the limits of the attention economy? Because it's not everything yet, although it is becoming increasingly pervasive. A couple weeks ago, Netflix's CEO also said that Fortnite was one of their main competitors, which, of course, Fortnite, people are spending a huge amount of time playing that, which means they're not watching Netflix as a result. Okay. If there's all this competition, So to go back to this chart here, you've got growing information, but you've got finite attention, which means increasing competition. That means that companies are going to be doing a lot to try and get your attention. It's fundamental to their business, it's fundamental to making money, that they have to grab your attention. And what this is leading companies to do is to design addiction into their products. So we will finish up today by looking at some of these aspects. So quick show of hands. Who here has an experience of themselves or others being addicted to their phones? One's not raising your hands or lying. We're all addicted. And the thing is, that's not unintentional. That is designed into these things. They're designed to be addictive precisely because they want our attention. So, how do companies do this? There's a number of different ways. First one is drawing attention. So, we all have primitive brains. We're all evolved from monkeys. And we have this primitive brain which reacts to certain things. So, bright lights, flashing lights, all of this sort of stuff draws our attention. So this is why companies will make, particular use of these sorts of techniques in order to draw our attention. I'll show you a really good example. Facebook notifications were originally blue. The problem they found was that nobody used them all that much. So what did they do? Well, they made them a nice bright red. And of course, when you've got a bright red notification, that draws your attention immediately to that. So again, that's a design choice. It could have been any other color. It could have been green. It could have been gray. But a bright red is what draws your attention. Another thing companies do is they try and make actions easy. So, good example here. You get done watching a video on Netflix, and it immediately starts auto-playing the next one. So what happens? You end up being like, well, another episode. And 5 hours later, you're like, I need to sleep. So this is an intentional choice. They've made that action easy. They've made it very, very easy to continue paying attention to Netflix, staying on that service. You have to actually engage and do something in order for it to stop. And I think once you're sort of aware of this, you'll see it everywhere. Another example of making actions easy, Facebook's like button. It was basically designed in 2009 to be a really simple way, a single click, to send positivity to friends. So again, Facebook studied this, they tested it, and they found that if you want to send positivity to friends, you could type something out, a nice comment or something, or you could just click like with one click. And they found that there was a lot more engagement when they made that action easier. Same with all the sort of proliferation of responses that they have nowadays. Another thing companies do, play on insecurities. So when LinkedIn was first launched, they had on everybody's profile page a visualization of the network that you were connected to. So if you were connected to famous people and connected to a lot of people, that would show up on your profile page. And that was basically a way to show to everybody else, aha, I'm really connected, or I'm connected to the right people. So what that meant was that others would look at your profile and they would want to match you, they would want to beat you. So they would want to get more and more friends on LinkedIn as well. So it became a status thing. And LinkedIn very self-consciously designed the system that way. Facebook got into a little bit of trouble when it was found out that they were telling advertisers that they could pinpoint teenagers who are feeling insecure or worthless. So again, if you're a company and you want to sell, say, some fashion, some clothing or something like that, maybe playing on teenagers who are feeling worthless, saying, if you buy our clothes, you'll feel better, that could be a really profitable way for a company to do that. Of course, ethically, that's a really terrible way to do things. But this is what Facebook was doing. It was playing on people's insecurities. Another thing companies do is reward the right behaviors. So one example from Facebook. This is a quote from a Facebook developer. Rewarding somebody with an instantaneous like after they post a photo can reinforce the action and potentially shift it from an occasional to a daily activity. So you may have noticed this. If you post a profile photo on Facebook, you tend to get a lot more likes for it than anything else. And in part, that's because Facebook has designed the system so that profile photos show up in other people's news feeds prominently. So you're more likely to get more likes. You're more likely to think, aha, Facebook really approves of me and my friends approve of me. And you're more likely to do that action again. So again, that's all built in to the system. Now, in terms of rewards, there's a really addictive way to do that, and that is to make rewards variable. So one of the most addictive things that we found is studies with rats. So we gave rats a little lever, and they could press it and they could get food. And they found that if the rat got food every single time it pressed the lever, it would do it until it was full, and then it would just stop. If you made that reward variable, so not every single time would it get food, that rat would sit there just pounding on that lever until it was exhausted. So it's the same sort of principle behind gambling. You never know if you're going to win. Maybe the next time is going to be the time that you win big. That's an incredibly addictive cycle, and that's a well-known psychological principle. It's so well-known that casinos are basically designed around it. So there's an absolutely fantastic book called Addiction by Design from Natasha Dow-Schull, which is all about how casinos use this sort of psychological information to make themselves incredibly addictive. Now the problem is that's now being exported to our smartphones. So rewards are now variable. My favorite example of this, the sort of pull to refresh mechanism that we're all used to nowadays. It was built and designed after the pull for a slot machine. So the pull for a slot machine is, again, that random reward. You never know if you're going to get a reward or not. It's the same thing with the pull to refresh. Will I get some new content? Will there be a new tweet? Will there be a new like or something like that? You just don't know. And it tends to be an incredibly addictive thing. I oftentimes find myself just doing it unconsciously. I refreshed 2 seconds ago. Why am I refreshing again? It's precisely because it is addictive. So, where does this leave us? So Tristan Harris was somebody who was building all of this stuff, and then he sort of had an epiphany and realized it was absolutely terrible. So he's now turned against all of this stuff, and he has a nice quote here. You could say that it's my responsibility to exert self-control over digital usage. But that's not acknowledging that there's 1,000 people on the other side of the screen whose job it is to break down whatever responsibility I can maintain. So I think this is quite important. Oftentimes we blame individuals for addiction, but if these things are being designed to be addictive, are we really to blame? Especially when there's, billions of dollars being put into designing these things. Now, this is, again, putting this back in the context of the attention economy. As more and more companies need to grab more and more of our attention, we can expect these sorts of addictive behaviors to become more and more prominent as well. So what can we do? The one option that Tristan Harris has come up with is something like, so there's fair trade stuff. So if you want to buy ethically sourced material from around the world, you put a little label on the product if it's fair trade, and you can buy that knowing that it has been it's been ethically sourced, that product. Now Tristan Harris's idea is that we could do that with apps and with programs. So we could have apps and programs which are designed to not be addictive. which aren't designed to sort of lure our attention in. And they could get that little stamp of approval as a result of it. I'm not entirely convinced by his solution, but there are sort of different ways to think about how we might fix this situation. Now, to conclude, I think this all leads to a sort of interesting question, which is, do we control what we watch, or does what we watch control us? The attention economy, I think, really sort of blurs these two questions. It's not entirely clear how much of what we're watching is because we're being manipulated into something, rather than because we've sort of freely chosen to do something. So, that is it for today. Are there any questions about any of that? Okay. Yep. There's not a specific author about it. There's sort of a number of people who have done work around it. Herbert Simon is probably the first one to really talk about that sort of thing, but I don't know that he ever uses the term attention economy. But it's sort of, it's been building up over the past 30, 40 years. Yep.
And Apple and Google, they are part of attention economy, but iOS has a function of screen time, and Android has digital well-being.
Yep.
So why they have those two things to help us to focus on digital well-being and screen time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we've seen over the past year, particularly, is Apple and Android and other services sort of giving you tools to manage your time and become aware of it. My sense is because of the uproar. So there was a lot of controversy over this over the past year, and them giving those tools is a basic way to say we're doing something about it. So there's not as much controversy. Okay, so we have seminars later today, and then we've got, I have office hours as well, if you have any other questions. Otherwise, I will see you all in the seminars.
Yo ayer salí con David,
One of my best friends, she has already life. So I asked her
Sí, pero la doctrina de un beso
Да, я думаю, вы можете даже, в принципе, Владимира даже можно дергать. Так. Ну, я имею в виду, что он там с вами произойдет. Я думаю, его
Yes, I have, but I want to say so that is the
Oye, ¿voy a usar?